Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the 11th session of LUMS Live. और मकसद सिर्फ ये है कि we get the dialogue going. You know, there are so many questions that people want to ask. अगर आपने कोई एक session हमारा अभी miss किया है, so look it up on Facebook or YouTube. We've had some fantastic conversations, और आज भी looking forward to really good conversation. The topic today is the gendered impact of COVID-19, and again we have a tremendous panel today. First and foremost, we have Dr. Nida Yasmeen Kirmani. Dr. Nida is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the Mushtaq Ahmed Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences, LUMS. Bahut shukriya aapka, Dr. Nida, and thank you for your time. We have Dr. Rabia Malik. Dr. Rabia is the Assistant Professor, again, at the Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences, LUMS. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Rabia. We have Dr. Hadia Majid, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics at the Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences, LUMS. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hadia. And last but not least, we have Ms. Angbeen Atif Mirza, Assistant Professor of Practice, Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law, LUMS. So, aap sabka bahut shukriya. If I could fire the first question at Dr. Nida, what is this gendered impact? What does that mean? What does that term mean? And how has, what's going on during this pandemic?
Thank you so much, Adil and everyone. Thank you for including me in this discussion. Is my voice clear?
We're good.
Okay,
we're good.
Great. So when we say the gendered impact of anything, we mean not just the impact on women, but the impact on women and men and on gender relations in general, right? So neither women nor men nor anyone else on the gender spectrum exists in a bubble. We're all in relation with each other. And so when we talk about the gendered impact, we mean how is this pandemic in particular affected gender relations, both within the household and outside of the household. So how are, and I think in today's discussion, at least from my end, I would focus a little more on how women in particular are being affected. But when we say gender, we certainly don't just mean women. We mean the relationships between all of the genders.
Because typically, when one talks about gender, the first thing that comes to people's mind, including mine, is a woman or women. But like you said, there's an equality there. If I could ask a question to Dr. Hadia. Dr. Hadia, during this pandemic and this crisis, women work, women are also unpaid workers and women are also paid workers. So tell us a little bit about workloads of paid and unpaid. What's going on there?
So when we thinking about unpaid work, there are two aspects that we need to consider. एक तो ये है कि हमारे यहाँ औरतें, बहुत सारी औरतें ऐसी हैं जो कि काम कर रही हैं, प्रोडक्टिव वर्क कर रही हैं, लेबर मार्केट का हिस्सा है, सो एग्रीकल्चर में काम कर रही हैं या फैमिली बिजनेस में काम कर रही हैं, लेकिन दे आर कंसिडर्ड फैमिली हेल्प, तो उनको उस काम का कोई दे आर नॉट गेटिंग वेजेस फॉर इट. तो दैट कैन, सम पीपल मे थिंक ऑफ दैट एज अनपेड वर्क, बट व्हेन वी आल्सो थिंक ऑफ अनपेड वर्क, उसमें हम रिप्रोडक्टिव वर्क की भी बात करते हैं. तो रिप्रोडक्टिव वर्क में आप घर का कामकाज, बच्चों की देखभाल, ये सब कुछ उसमें डाल देती हैं. और उसमें आप एक चीज जो हम जरा भूल जाते हैं वो ये है कि एल्डरली का ख्याल रखना. जो हमारे जो ज़ईफ हैं, वो जो घर में हैं, उनका भी ज्यादातर जो ख्याल रखती हैं वो खवातीन रखती हैं. तो पेड एंड अनपेड वर्क दोनों में औरतों का बहुत बड़ा हाथ है. अनपेड वर्क में ज्यादातर काम जो है वो खवातीन कर रही हैं हमारे माशरे में. इसमें जो हाउस होल्ड चोर्स है, बच्चों की देखभाल है, एल्डरली की देखभाल है, वो ज्यादातर खवातीन कर रही हैं. अब जब ये पैंडेमिक जब आया है हमारा, तो उसमें सबसे मेजर इम्पैक्ट जो हुआ है वो ये है कि वी नाउ स्पेंडिंग अ लॉट मोर टाइम एट होम. तो उसमें एक तो ये है कि ठीक है, मर्द हजरात are stepping up, they're helping out with household chores, लेकिन सबसे बड़ा जो इम्पैक्ट आया है वो ये है कि हमारे बच्चे जो है वो स्कूल नहीं जा रहे. तो उसका जो बर्डन हो रहा है वो मर्द औरतों दोनों पे हो रहा है. एंड अ लॉट ऑफ केसेस मर्द को घर पे काम करना है, दे वर्किंग फ्रॉम होम, परहैप्स रिमोट वर्क कर रहे हैं, उसमें बच्चे भी बीच में आ रहे हैं, उनका ख्याल रखना खवातीन के लिए भी ये बहुत बड़ा मसला है कि बच्चे भी हैं घर पे, घर का बाकी कामकाज भी करना है, उसके ऊपर से नौकरी भी करनी है. और अगर नौकरी नहीं भी कर रही हैं तो उसके अलावा भी आपका जो ये अनपेड वर्क है वो तो कम नहीं होता है. इन अ लॉट ऑफ केसेस बिकॉज ऑफ द पैंडेमिक द अनपेड वर्क इज एक्चुअली गॉन अप, क्योंकि जहाँ पे आपको पहले हेल्प थी you had hired help, in a lot of cases you've cut back on that. Even when you have hired help, पहले आपके 5 घंटे के लिए तो बच्चे घर से बाहर चले जाते थे, आपके मियाँ भी बाहर चले जाते थे, अब तो वो नहीं हो रहा है. तो उसका जो है बर्डन इन टर्म्स ऑफ कि आप इतना सारा टाइम अब इस पे गुजार रहे हैं, वो बर्डन आपकी वेल बीइंग पे होता है, उससे आपकी मेंटल हेल्थ पे भी इम्पैक्ट आ सकता है, आपकी फिजिकल हेल्थ पे भी इम्पैक्ट आ सकता है. ये सारे इम्पैक्ट्स आपको पेंडेमिक में नजर आ रहे हैं.
डॉक्टर राबिया, मुझे ऐसे लग रहा है ये पैनल देख के कि खवातीन ही काम कर रही हैं, मर्द जो हैं देर आउट ऑफ वर्क. ओके, बिकॉज it's a lopsided panel today, which isn't really a bad thing. मेरा सवाल आपसे ये है, of course, I'm saying it jokingly. People get trolled so quickly these days. मेरा सवाल आपसे ये है, given that everybody's home these days, and like Dr. Hadia said कि जो शौहर भी काम करने जा रहे थे, वो भी आप घर पे ही हैं. Professionally speaking, कोई genders की productivity में कोई फर्क होगा? Are women working more? Are men working more? Do we have any data or any numbers to suggest anything there?
Right. So, मुझे लगता है कि इसमें भी there's two different ways to think about it, and we should think about it like at two levels. Because when we're talking about like professional productivity, right? There's the kinds of jobs that women sort of tend to work more in certain industries compared to men. And in that regard, those different industries are affected differently by the pandemic, right? So if we look globally in general, women tend to be in more face-to-face professions. They tend to be more sort of, airline workers, salon workers, a lot of domestic helpers, like Hadia was mentioning, teachers, secretaries. So a lot of things that require face-to-face contact, and a lot of businesses jo aajkal band hain, like salons are closed, airlines are barely flying. So in that sense, I think professional productivity is being affected in a different way. Not to say that men aren't affected in the same industries, but generally the point I'm trying to make is that there are certain industries where women are highly represented compared to men. So in that sense, I think their careers are being affected differently. But then the other aspect of it, which as an academic I can sort of closer to home or closer to the heart, is what about jobs where both men and women are working in similar sort of industries and are both working from home, which is, I think, what you were alluding to. So like take academics, for example. So most of them are working from home, be they men or women. But usme we already see a huge difference in research productivity for reasons that I think Hadia was already talking about. So just to give you an example, I work in political science and partially in economics. Or un dono fields mein, some of the editors at the top journals have been tweeting about how submissions have changed to journals in the last month and a half, which is, the period that people have been working from home. Interestingly, the first thing that I found surprising was that submissions are actually up at most of the top journals compared to sort of the same time last year. But all that increase is because of an increase in male submissions. So female submissions are either constant or have actually declined in certain fields. And I think that's sort of a very, very clear example of how professional productivity, even in cases where men and women have the same sort of bars for promotion and the same sort of expectations, women are sort of being affected in a very different way than men.
Angbeen, I have a family member who's a psychiatrist, and he was mentioning that, the mental health patients have gone up in recent times. I'm sure there's data on that. I don't know. But my question to you is, do you think this crisis will have a long-term effect on household relations? Or, once we go back to normal, if we go back to normal, whatever normal means, would we just be, what we were 3 months ago?
Well, history has shown that we have very short kind of memory. So we don't know whether it'll last for 3 months or it'll last longer. But I think what we're seeing a little bit of is there's a movement into opposite directions. So because like Hadia and Rabia have said that men are home now much more than they have been before, and work that we could previously outsource to people like, potentially childcare work or cleaning work or other types of work is now all being done in-house by people who have not previously been doing this work. There is a chance that this might lead to a respect of the homemaker's job. So an improvement in relations within families. But factually speaking, worldwide, there's been an increase of domestic violence. So factually speaking, I think the more recurrent theme is that people are not very happy being kind of cooped up in the same space. And even like our government has recognized this, and we've established a helpline. The Ministry of Human Rights has now established a helpline to recognize that there are instances of domestic violence. So as much as we would like to think that there'd be kind of more respect for each other's work, It's women are being women, and other genders also are being forced to kind of live with their abusers, and that might have impact once this pandemic is potentially over, because those relations won't obviously change immediately.
Dr. Nida, we talked a little bit about paid and unpaid work and workers. I would want to know, would this lockdown, and hopefully it'll finish at some point, how would it affect things like division of labor and gender relations in households? Would there be a shift? Would we go back to what we were? Would we have more women working, more men working? What's going to happen?
I mean, I wish I could see in the future and find out कि lockdown कब खत्म होगा. It seems like we're in this for the long haul, and we also don't really know exactly what's happening right now in households. अभी अंगबीन ने domestic violence की बात की है, तो certainly पाकिस्तान में it's a good thing कि government की तरफ से थोड़ी सी acknowledgement हुई है कि domestic violence is an issue. ये हमारी unfortunately ये भी बड़ी बात है. In other countries we've seen like France, they've actually France and I think maybe Italy or Spain, one of the other European countries, has made it so that women who are suffering from abuse in the household actually can go to the pharmacy and use a code word to have a kind of distress signal for the authorities to be able to intervene and provide them with some kind of safe space. France, they also opened up hotels for women to be able to go and stay in the rooms in the hotels if their home has become an unsafe space for them. Pakistan mein at least like awareness, to thodi si acknowledgement to aayi hai unki taraf se, lekin we actually haven't seen that any proactive steps have been taken, even in non-pandemic circumstances for women and for sometimes for especially for children and women who are in abusive situations. There's very few options for them. Lekin pandemic mein to aur bhi zyada like it becomes a lot worse. So I don't know, like we can sense that things are worse here. The other thing that we've talked about unpaid work, and you asked me about that as well, Adil. And we have a lot of time use surveys, and I think Dr. Hadia probably is more well versed in the numbers than I am. I'm a qualitative kind of person. Lekin usme, at least from the superficial understanding I have, like even if you look at in again normal times, the amount of unpaid work that women do as compared to what men do in the household is 1 hour for a man's unpaid work in the household is equivalent to 11 hours for women. In other countries, you don't see such a big disparity. There's always a difference. Women all over the world are working more in the home than men. But in South Asia in particular, and this includes like other countries in South Asia, the difference is huge in terms of the expectations of what amount of work women will put in the household. So of course, if you're being expected to work from home now, and you're already working from home doing unpaid work, तो फिर आपका double burden हो जाता है, जैसे Dr. Hadia ने कहा, आपका triple burden हो जाता है if you're also expected to act as your children's school teacher at home. So I mean, the strains for women, we don't know exactly what they're, but we can guess they're probably pretty bad. And I hope that when the pandemic is over, something positive shifts and there's more awareness about these inequalities. But there's no telling, and that's why this conversation is so important. ताकि लोगों को थोड़ा सा अंदाजा हो, there's a bit of a sense that this is a real issue.
Dr. Hadia, Dr. Nida mentioned how the workload of women has kind of increased. Or at least maybe it was there, we're just kind of addressing it more now. My question to you would be, during or after this pandemic, do you think there will be economic opportunities for women? Would it convert into that? Is there any way that women can benefit somehow because of this pandemic economically?
Well, the way things are going, it looks like we're headed toward a big global recession. And that's not surprising because आपकी manufacturing sector पे बहुत बड़ा impact आया है, आपकी services sector पे बहुत बड़ा impact आया है. अब पाकिस्तान में ख़वातीन का manufacturing sector में actually employment rate काफी low है. So manufacturing jobs by and large are being held by men. Which means कि जो layoffs हुए हैं या अगर layoffs भी नहीं जो cutbacks हुए हैं, अगर employment पे impact आया है तो men पे ज़्यादा बड़ा impact आया होगा, ख़वातीन पे इतना बड़ा impact नहीं आया होगा. लेकिन अगर when we come out of this pandemic, and hopefully that's going to be, I mean, we're going to see some positive movements towards that in the near future. there's no saying कि manufacturing पे in terms of the kind of jobs that can be created कितनी ज़्यादा होंगी. जब jobs create होंगी, given that women's secondary status in our labor market, it's more likely कि जो भी jobs create होंगी, वो सबसे पहले मर्दों के पास जाएंगी, ख़वातीन के पास नहीं आएंगी. Similarly, services sector पे भी बहुत बड़ा impact आया. जैसे राबिया ने कहा, हमारे यहाँ salons जो है बंद हैं. आपकी any industry, any job जहाँ पे close contact है, वो सब for the time being is completely closed off. As lockdown eases, hopefully that will become better. लेकिन उसमें बहुत बड़ा हाथ ये होगा कि how many businesses have gone under in the meantime? What is going to be? Can they really resurface again? Once they do resurface, then of course there will be a demand for jobs. Lekin what we have to remember is that women traditionally in Pakistan's labor market have held vulnerable and precarious jobs. They haven't seen benefits. Very few of them have job benefits. And I don't see that improving in the near future because of the kind of pressure that businesses are going to be under when we come out of this lockdown, and the kind of pressure that they're going to be facing in terms of profitability. One positive lining is that the extent of this lockdown may make it easier for us to look at home-based work in a more positive light and think about how can you work remotely and how can we tap into all of these resources and make sure that आपका labor market becomes accessible through the home. तो वो हमारे यहाँ क्योंकि ख़वातीन की mobility in the public sphere is limited in any case, अगर आप working from home, if you make it easier in the next few months, then women's productive work or them being engaged productively in the labor market while sitting at home, uske chances improve ho jayenge. And that could be a silver lining of this pandemic कि आप ख़वातीन घर पे बैठ के while not being in the public sphere, while having all of those mobility restrictions, हो सकता है productive work में और ज़्यादा engage कर सकें once we come back out of the pandemic.
Dr. Rabia, Dr. Nida mentioned, I think it was France perhaps, where, if you're a victim of domestic violence, you can go to a pharmacy and say something and they'll respond somehow. Pakistan में बहुत ज़्यादा वो नहीं है, just as an example. And she also mentioned कि शायद government ने बहुत ज़्यादा steps अभी नहीं लिए कि भी क्या करना चाहिए इस सिलसिले में. So my question would be, or two questions rather would be, is there anything that, people, men and women together, can do to get the attention of policymakers कि यार ये देखो ये 2-3-4 areas हैं ये बड़े ज़रूरी हैं, or is there anything that policymakers needs to do now for women in particular?
I mean, that's a great question. I wish I had like a sort of silver bullet kind of policy recommendation just to सारे मसले हल हो जाएं. लेकिन I think and it's hard because in part it's difficult because there is no one policy size that fits everybody, right? Like if we talk about the kinds of jobs that we do and we talk about organizations maybe increasing, timelines for promotions and those sorts of things, those sort of, that's great on the one hand because of how the pandemic is affecting everybody in productivity. But on the other hand, there's concerns that that's just kind of exacerbating existing differences between men and women and how they're affected by this. And so on the other hand, if you have a policy that's like only targeted towards women, there might be some men who actually share equal responsibilities at home, for instance, who could, perhaps rightfully complain that they're sort of losing out in that sense. So I think it's really hard to come up with like a policy prescription in that sense, but I think it's what's really missing maybe, and what's really important moving forward, as Dr. Hadia was mentioning, we are going to be entering a global recession. It's going to affect every country, including Pakistan. I think what's really important is for policymakers to make sure that women's voices are heard when they're making those policies. So for instance, she was talking about, working from home becoming something that's more normal over the long term. I don't think that's something necessarily that perhaps a lot of male heads of organizations would think of themselves, because I think women have probably been thinking of that for longer just because of the unique situations that they're in, where they're balancing childcare, they're generally doing more flexible jobs so that they can kind of be at home, try to work from home, and that becomes more normal. So I think what's important, whether we think of it at the household level or at the level of the government, I think at the household level, what's really missing, or what I really wish was sort of happening more, is I think we need male allies for this. I mean, it's important for us to talk about this, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation. But I feel like as an individual, until sort of the men in the household are buying into the fact that this is a problem and they're cognizant of it, there's only so much we can do. But once they accept, and I mean, it's not even just the men or the spouses, it's also sort of parents and children. There needs to be sort of a mindset shift, which is true, again, outside of the pandemic as well, but hopefully this can kind of lead to that realization, especially people who are watching, कि बीवियां घर के काम भी कर रही हैं, बच्चों का भी कर रही हैं, homeschool भी कर रही हैं, अपना काम भी कर रही हैं. It's impossible to write the sort of triple threat that's going on. And so I think at the household level, we need that kind of buy-in from the household members to, and I think recognizing that there's a problem is the first step at like the household level, and then you can sort of extrapolate that to the organizational level, to the government level. If you look at countries with female heads of state, which are very few countries right now, I know they've sort of dealt with the pandemic in a slightly different way, and in a lot of cases have had a lot of success. And I think what that shows is simply that we do need female policymakers at all levels of the government, so that just to make sure that sort of they're more likely to think more in terms of how are women, you know, what kind of policies will benefit women more, and making sure that those voices are heard, hopefully in the longer term will help to sort of control or sort of, you know, make sure that so the policy interventions that are made in a way that they can benefit men and women both.
I mean, Rabia mentioned, you know, twice. Once she said, you know, making men allies, and then she mentioned the heads of state women, where, you know, we believe the pandemic is being dealt with slightly more efficiently. So my question to you would be, what would happen if we include women in task forces and decision-making process? Do you see women in those roles in Pakistan? And if we were to include more women, would it impact or change the policy of the task force?
Well, I'd like to say that I hope to see more women on, you know, task forces. And I guess if you think about it, regardless of the pandemic, if you think about it as just any policy, having half of your population represented on task force is just, it's a basic rational point. You can't have policy impacting half your population without any representation on your task forces or you know, people who are making the policy. And so that's a problem that we really need to recognize. And I'm hoping that the pandemic is going to kind of bring it to the fore like it hasn't come before. And I mean, and now specifically speaking about the pandemic, women, there are lots of women who are healthcare workers. A lot of our nurses are women, so they are at the front lines. I mean, there are lots of women who are in informal jobs and they've lost their jobs, but they still are bearing the brunt of, you know, the household work, like we've already said before, care for the elderly, homeschooling. I'm sure lots of women are going to have very informed opinions about schooling of children after this is over. And so the inclusion of women at all levels is very, very important. And I think it's good to mention that at least in Punjab, there has been legislation in the past couple of years where they've made it a point to kind of lay down a quota for women on every single kind of panel or policy or board or anything that the government has to make. So all laws now specify that there have to be women. So it's true that the government has been thinking about this in the past. Hopefully after the pandemic, when they're making policies which are going to directly impact women in future circumstances such as these, it's impossible to make any kind of useful policy without having women. At least half representation needs to be women for it to be real.
More than half, because I think the numbers are 52% women and 48% men. So more than half. Dr. Nida, you know, we hear about, you know, gender inequalities and of course, economically, you know, men being given opportunities more than women. Do you think after this pandemic, there's going to be some equality? Do you think that's going to happen?
So far, it's not looking very good. What we all have been talking about so far is how in many ways the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities. And here I also wanted to bring out the intersectionality aspect. We talked about women in general bearing the brunt of this, but of course for women from the poorer socioeconomic strata, they have even more of a burden. So from women from higher income groups, of course, if you are able to afford domestic help, so you are now burdened more with housework, because what happens in our context in the upper economic strata is that women who are able to have a professional job like we do can afford to have domestic help often. But we never expect the men to actually change their behavior. And so I think what you noticed about this conversation as well, and what most conversations about gender are women dominated. And in one sense, that's great. But in another sense, that means that men are not part of the conversation. And so we really need men to be part of the conversation actively, not just as observers, but also as participants in terms of thinking about how they can change their own behavior and their own idea of their masculinity, because nothing's going to change, because women have been trying to change for decades or centuries even, and we've been doing pretty well at changing, but men haven't changed very much. And so we really need for men to step up and change. And abhi tak to we haven't seen that much positive change in terms of awareness as the pandemic has unfolded. But we hope that having these conversations might provide an opportunity for more awareness. And this is what many of us are saying, not just about gender relations, but also about the way the economic system is structured, that, we already had these pre-existing inequalities in terms of income inequality, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of access to technology. And these are related both to gender and also to class. So if we become more aware about these during the pandemic because they're more pronounced, then maybe we can change these things as we think about reorganizing our relationships and our society in the post-pandemic phase.
It's funny you mentioned men generally don't change. One thing that baffles the scientific world is jellyfish don't evolve. Why haven't they evolved in 50 million years? So men don't change. Some species don't change. No, I'm just kidding. Dr. Hadia, I have two questions for you. One is from a friend, Shireen Mehri, and she wants to know, is it realistic to see an increase in work from home for the majority of companies, businesses in Pakistan, given the current system that are in place? So if you can quickly answer that, then I have a second question for you.
Sure. So actually, we have very limited capacity to have work from home. I think the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics put out a bulletin a few weeks ago, which calculated that only about 15% to 19% of professionals have the capacity to work from home. So what we're hoping for is that as the pandemic continues and companies now start coming out of the lockdown, they're going to come up with innovative ways to make work from home more possible for their employees. And they're going to realize that we need to have some flexibility as far as work from home is concerned. Now, the flip side of this is, and this is something that's now being realized much more in North America and Europe, is that parents are just doing so much. We've already talked about all of these triple burdens that families have. कि आपने काम भी करना है, अपने बच्चों का भी ख्याल करना है, उनकी homeschooling करनी है, अपने घर का काम काज और भी करना है. अब उसमें that means कि आपके जो work from home hours है, they just stretch from 7 in the morning all the way up to 2 a.m. And what companies might do once we come back from the pandemic is, पहले तो ये था ना कि अच्छा 7 बज गए हैं, घर सब चले गए हैं, अब हम आपको कोई काम नहीं देंगे. अब कहेंगे अच्छा पहले तो आप कर रहे थे, अब क्यों नहीं कर रहे? Pandemic में भी तो किया है, अब भी करें. So it's not really clear at this point whether work from home is really a good strategy in the long run, because it just might mean that workers are just burdened more and more in our capitalist structure. तो एक तो ये बात है. दूसरी ये है कि we have to be a little bit careful when we think about work from home. Traditionally, in the Pakistani context, women have done home-based work for the majority of your work that we can think of, particularly your lower income strata. Lower income strata जो हमारा है, उसमें up to 80% of women who are in the manufacturing sector or doing informal work are working from home. अब उनकी capacity to work from home actually means कि वो sewing कर रही हैं, ये low income, ये low productivity work कर रही हैं. वो जो है in this pandemic case, and once we go into the global recession, that is going to see a major hit, because they're not going to see those orders come in as your production slows down because of reduced demand. So on the one side, we're hoping that your higher end businesses hai, they're going to increase the capacity to allow their workers to work from home. But at the other side, we do have to consider the many issues that working from home is going to bring up for our workers.
I couldn't get your second question in. I'm going to come to you later, but I have a question for Dr. Rabia. Everyone is talking about, empathy and sympathy and, cooperation and coordination and coming together and all of that. So really bridging all the gaps that we have. So one of the major gaps that we talk about is the gender gap. So do you think because of this pandemic, we've identified some gender gaps between the genders? Or we bridge them, perhaps?
I mean, I wish I could say we've bridged them, but I think, as you know, everyone's sort of been mentioning in different ways, I think, if anything, this has exposed exactly how stark those gaps are and perhaps have become even worse during the pandemic. I do think, I'm not sure if it's necessarily introduced new dimensions to the gender gap, but I do think it's definitely sort of exacerbated existing differences, whether we're talking about professional or personal lives. You know, Hadia was, everyone actually has been talking about sort of women being burdened more by household work. And I think Nida mentioned that this is so much more stark in South Asia, which is absolutely true. What was surprising to me is how stark this is currently even in Europe and North America. So just yesterday, I was reading an article in the New York Times because they've conducted the first survey that was done during the pandemic. So they're sort of asking about division of labor in the household and sort of who's primarily responsible for childcare duties and those sorts of things. So it's, of course, a US sample, but it's representative of the US population. It's about 2,200 people that they interviewed. And what was interesting, or perhaps depressing, is that they asked questions about who sort of has primary responsibility for household tasks, who has primary responsibility for childcare. And about between 65 and 70%, it's the woman who has primary responsibility if it's not shared. And, you know, those who are saying no, they're talking about equal sharing. They're not saying that the other spouse or the partner is responsible for it. And what was really, I think, stark about this in particular was that this is the overall effect that they're finding, or the overall difference. But even when we limit ourselves to looking only at households where both partners are working from home full time. So it's not the case that, you know, औरत की जो job थी वो खत्म आजकल हो गई है, तो वो इसलिए घर पे बच्चों का ख्याल ज्यादा रख रही हैं. Even अगर हम वो देखें, लोग जो मियाँ बीवी दोनों जो हैं घर से full time काम कर रहे हैं, the number will go down from, you know, 67 to 65, for instance, or from 70 to 67%. And so there's not a huge difference. And so I think those gender gaps that we've been talking about for years, whether it's about, you know, women earning less or having to do more unpaid work. I think, if anything, the pandemic, unfortunately, instead of so far bridging them, has primarily made them worse. And if those are statistics that are coming out of sort of developed countries where we think that men in general are more cognizant of these sorts of problems and hopefully more helpful at home, then I kind of don't really want to think about what these numbers might look like if somebody were to do a similar survey in South Asia or in Pakistan. I would hope that by talking about these, we are moving towards bridging them. But I think at this point, this is still sort of just optimism, unfortunately.
Optimism is a good thing. Is a good thing. And I know one man who helps more now these days at home. At least one person I know of. Angbeen, because of the lockdown, we talk about inaccessibility of resources and opportunities. Resources nahi hai, kaam nahi hai. But women are working, harder. Not that they weren't working hard before. So my question to you would be, if you compare the accessibility or inaccessibility of resources between men and women, तो क्या औरतों के पास मौका ज्यादा है इस वक्त कुछ काम करने का, या मर्दों के पास मौका ज्यादा है during the lockdown especially?
Well, as a base statement, I think मर्दों के पास हमेशा मौका ज्यादा होता है to get more work done. For Pakistan, that's been true before the pandemic anyway. Women are by and large occupied more in the informal sector. So access for women, and like Hadia said, Abhi, they are kind of second-rate citizens even when it comes to the labor market. So the preference is always to hire men. So to begin with, men have always had kind of greater access than women. What the pandemic does, I think, is that it makes that, for some classes, maybe it doesn't have so much of a difference. For example, for the people who are working in professional jobs, like we are, for example, it doesn't make a huge difference because we have the capacity to be able to do that work from home and have access to opportunity through this great world of the internet, which is really the only connection that we have to other people in this time. But the problem with the internet is that in certain social classes, women's access to the internet is also restricted. It is surveilled and it is regulated by their families, by their in-laws. And so it's like this pandemic is going to hit them much worse than it's going to hit other people with regular access to the internet and the world outside. So I think it would be safe to say that women have less access than they would have otherwise. And even in lockdown, we see that men are generally, by and large, going about their lives, other than the fact that jobs are harder to complete, or some people have in certain social classes lost their jobs entirely. Men still have greater access in their work, and their lives are least affected They help out in the household when they want to help out, but there's nothing really kind of binding them to do it. If the work has to be done, the women have to do it. So like you said, I think the women's unpaid labor has gone up, and their access to the outside world for opportunity has probably gone down. It's gone down.
Dr. Nida, one community we haven't mentioned is the transgenders. So tell us a little bit about that. And also you wanted to add a little bit about domestic violence and unemployment. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to talk about with this topic because it touches on so many aspects of our gender relations in society. So I did want to also just bring in the point, and I think shuru mein maine kaha women, men, and people on the gender spectrum. So main isliye kehti hu taaki hame yaad rahe ki we have a lot of folks in our communities who are either transgender or particularly members of the Khwaja Sira community. And they've been hit very hard also by the pandemic because their sources of income have also dried up. A masla ye hai ki a lot of times when we have these relief programs, these communities can get overlooked. So I have I know a lot of friends who've been fundraising and things for them, but I also just want to keep that in our minds that this is also a group of people whose gendered position in society is putting them at even further disadvantage during the pandemic. Dusri baat wo ye thi ki as we see unemployment going up and a lot of people out of work, and just to link it back to domestic violence, the studies have shown that when unemployment does go up, that you do see an increase also in domestic violence, not only because of the fact that everyone is cooped up at home, but also because getting back to the idea of masculinity, our whole idea of masculinity is so tied in with men being the main breadwinners of their family. And we know that much of the time, men are not able to fulfill that role because of the economic circumstances. Lekin itna unke upar pressure hota hai from their own upbringing and the society around them, that the fact that they're not able to earn will create more strains, more tensions. And unfortunately, what happens is that frustration and anger is often taken out on the women and the children in the household. So what ends up happening is you take out your anger on the person who's weaker than you. So if your husband is feeling frustrated कि उनके पास काम नहीं है, so then उनका गुस्सा अपनी बीवी पे वो निकालेंगे, और बीवी भी अगर उनका गुस्सा है वो कहाँ निकालेंगी अपने बच्चों पे. So it's this vicious circle, a cycle of violence. So that's why I also say it's not just important for men to be observing the conversation or just allies, but actively thinking about how ideas around masculinity can also change so that it's not considered to be shameful or unmasculine to pick up and help out in the household. There are men who are stepping up, and there definitely are. And men aren't like jellyfish. Men do evolve like all human beings. I know aapne mazak mein kaha hai, but the evidence from other contexts tells us that if men in other countries have stepped up and started taking up the burden of unpaid work more, there's nothing inherent about men that makes them unable to do this work. There's something about our culture, there's something about our society that needs to change. And this needs to change in the minds of women and men, because sometimes women also perpetuate these ideas about certain masculine gender roles. So we all need to change the way that we think about things.
And I think one way is to have this conversation. And I think this could be, a blessing in disguise, the pandemic, the lockdown, where we are forced to live in a space where we need to sort things out. Dr. Hadia, Dr. Nida mentioned 2 or 3 words: anger, pressure, stress, strain, in the family. What do you think, what kind of stress or strain are families facing right now? Economics would be one of them, sure. Any other kind of stress, strain, or pressure that families are facing?
So one thing is that the economic stress is spilling over into other things, like Nida has just mentioned, right? Okay, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anxiety, and that anxiety is being felt by everyone in the household. We've been talking about men and women in this conversation because, of course, it's a panel on gender, but children are facing a lot of stress. Children are very anxious. Their entire lives have been turned upside down. They're no longer going to school. They're not seeing their friends. They're being homeschooled by their parents. Their parents, a lot of times, have no idea what's going on. They're seeing their parents being anxious themselves, and there is going to be psychological impacts on our children. Their schools have been disrupted. Their education has been disrupted. that is going to have impact on their well-being, yes, but also on their cognitive and non-cognitive development, on their socialization, and we know from economics that disruptions in schooling has a major impact on your lifetime earnings. So that's one group that we haven't really been talking about in this panel, and wo bahut major strain hai, and of course that has an impact on everyone within the family. We've talked about gender relations a lot in this panel. We're talking about the relations are coming under stress. Domestic violence ki of course baat ho chuki hai. Lekin what perhaps we also need to think about is again the impact on the elderly. So the other people within the household. Unki health ke upar bhi impact hum pandemic ka jo impacts major jo hum uske bare mein soch rahe hain, the major people who we've been very worried about because of what's been happening in North America are the elderly, and the same goes in Pakistan too. Even in Pakistan, the elderly, unki health pe kya impact aa raha hai because of the economic fallout that we're seeing of this pandemic, that's spilling over to these other generations who we see in our extended families. One other thing that is straining relations within the household is just the fact that hum ek dusre se mil nahi pa rahe. We are a very close-knit culture. We are a culture where we thrive on being able to meet not just our close relations, but our extended relations as well. Our lower income communities depend upon that close-knit culture where you're meeting everyone on a regular basis, because that keeps your relations strong. That is no longer happening because everyone is scared to come out of the house. So that is going to have impacts not just psychologically, but it's going to spill over into economic impacts as well. Agar aapke paas, if you're no longer able to maintain these relations with your extended network, jab aapke paas koi crisis hoga, in addition to the pandemic, who are you going to turn to? So these are all things which we need to think about, which we need to be cognizant of, and we need to consider कि आपके ये जो impacts आ रहे हैं, they're cyclical in some ways. You lost your job, you lost your connections to the other families, and that's going to come back and make your getting up on your feet more difficult as we come out of this pandemic.
Dr. Rabia, Dr. Hadia thinks it's going to be more difficult. So my question to you would be, would this new normal, would it create new inequities, or would it actually help bridge the gap? And if it would create new inequities, are they fixable?
I do think, like, sort of similar to what we've been talking about, a lot of the differences, especially if we're talking about it just from like a gendered perspective, a lot of the inequities I think are similar to what we've been seeing. But as of course, as Dr. Hadi just mentioned, there's sort of new strains to relationships that maybe come out of the economic stress, but are ones that we haven't necessarily seen before. You know, that all sounds very sort of pessimistic, but also very realistic. What I would hope though is that, I think as you mentioned earlier, this situation, this very sort of unprecedented and uncertain situation is creating a lot of different kinds of stress, but it's also forcing us to maybe have some of these conversations that, as I think Dr. Nida mentioned earlier, women have been talking about a lot of these issues for a long time, but perhaps the one sort of tiny silver lining that comes out of being in this situation is that this is a conversation that's now being had more broadly and being paid attention to more broadly. And so I would hope that by, taking that into account, by having these conversations, by sort of us as ordinary people, also not just, policymakers at the higher level, but us at the household level, like you've been talking about, men are stepping up and to some extent, and hopefully, there's more of that if these conversations are had. And so I would hope that to sort of end, this train of thought on a more optimistic note is that perhaps we will see some bridging of these inequities if, we're having the right conversations and if we're having an open dialogue. And as we've mentioned earlier, I think what's most important is not just us talking about it, but having buy-in from men and from women in the household. I think that point that Nida raised is really, really important, that it's not just about the partners and the spouses and the sons, like not just the men in the house who need to understand this, but a lot of times women in the households, whether it's, the mothers or the mother-in-laws or even the wives themselves, sometimes because of how they've defined what a masculine role at home is and what a feminine role is, are very reluctant to let the men help out with a lot of these tasks. And so I hope by having these conversations, and because there's so much sort of highlighting of these issues right now because of the pandemic, I would hope that in the long term there is room to sort of bridge some of these inequities under, whatever the new normal looks like for us in a few months.
Angbeen, speaking about bridging these inequities, were we ready? Was Pakistan ready for this changing gender equity landscape, or are we receptive now? Are we doing enough?
Well, in the pandemic, really it's unclear what we're doing, given that I think the government's just trying to grappling with whatever's coming its way right now. So I don't think that anything specific is being done with women or like minority genders in mind at the moment. But it is important for that to be kept in mind when any kind of major policy is being developed now. So, for example, in the last couple of years, we've had some women-friendly legislation. We've recognized sexual harassment. We've recognized domestic violence, legally speaking. We've recognized acid attacks are more particular to women. So these recognitions need to be built on, and they need to be taken further. And we need to incorporate learning from the pandemic into this kind of legislative focus that we've sort of started leaning towards. One thing that the government has done, which is a positive, is that the helpline that we've already spoken about is kind of an indicator that they recognize that women and minority genders might be are more affected by the pandemic, and the negative of the pandemic is hitting them harder than others. So that's a good indicator. It needs to go further from that, especially when people are going back to their lives in the new normal, and we don't know what that new normal is going to look like yet. So the government really needs to be on its toes in kind of, tapping what needs to be done. Another thing that I think we need to keep in mind at this point is that post-crisis, women and minority genders always suffer more than men do. So, for example, after the floods, farmers lost their crop, and there was extreme panic, and a lot of girls were sold, for example, to kind of make ends meet at different levels. So it is an established fact, especially in this region, that women suffer more than men do, and that needs to be taken into account when any kind of policy is being made, especially now in the pandemic. Again, flexible work options, and these things, this is low-lying fruit. So for workplaces and for the government and for legislators to kind of incorporate these daycare options and work from home options and flexible options is not that hard to do. And maybe this is just the trigger, very extreme trigger that we were waiting for to make this happen. But yeah, there's a lot to be done, and we're really just at the starting point of it.
Last question for everybody, one word, one sentence answer. Angbeen said maybe this was a trigger. Any takeaways, any good things, any benefits that we can see because of this pandemic? Any blessing in disguise? Dr. Nida, very quickly.
But I still have so much to say.
Go ahead.
But
go
other
ahead.
things. तो एक बात तो ये था कि the strains on the healthcare system, हमने इसके बारे में बात नहीं की. So we should really talk about that, because this is a virus, this is like a health pandemic, and we've been talking a lot about unpaid work in the home. But we should also remember that the fact that people are getting sick, and like we said, women are the ones who are often doing the care work in the household. So this means that not just people who are COVID-19 patients, but also people who have all sorts of other illnesses aren't able to access health services. Our hospitals are filling up if they're not full already. Women are going to be the ones who are picking up the slack at home. And if people have to choose who goes to the doctor and who doesn't go to the doctor, sadly, it's women and girls who probably won't be the first ones to be taken. So this is something we need to take notice of. दूसरी बात ये कि जब pandemics दूसरे मुल्कों में हुए, like the Ebola outbreak, it was reproductive health services that ended up suffering more. So in countries where your health system is already strained, like Pakistan, it's the healthcare services that are there for women that end up being sacrificed first. So this is something we have to be really aware of. So ये मतलब दो चीजें थीं that I really wanted to put on the table. In terms of like takeaways, I think just there is more conversation during COVID-19 pandemic about this gender aspect. I've seen talks happening in the United States. I've read a few articles about this. Domestic violence wala issue has been raised a lot in the international media. So this is something that is a positive change with this pandemic, that there's more awareness. And folks like you all, LUMS has organized this session. That is a good step. because these conversations weren't actually happening last time we had humanitarian crises or pandemics. So I think that ye achhi baat hai, and if these conversations can somehow translate into policy shift, then that would be a real success. Policy shift and behavior change. So ye dono cheezein agar ho jaye to bahut achhi baat hogi. Thank you.
Hadia, do you want to add to the healthcare point? Otherwise, my question stands. Any takeaways, any good things, any learnings from this pandemic for now?
Well, one of the good things is the impact on the environment. So for better or for worse, we've all slowed down. We're all taking life a little bit more slowly. We're spending more time with our children. And you can see the impact on the smog in Lahore. The other thing is we're all washing our hands. So that's the best thing that's come out of it.
And spending less money on consumer products, hopefully. Dr. Rabia, you wanted to add to the healthcare point before I ask you the same question, the takeaways?
Yes, just very quickly. I mean, I think Dr. Nida covered a lot of the important points when we talk about healthcare and why it's important to think about it more broadly. But I think in particular, because there's been sort of a lot of people saying that, men in general are being infected or have a higher mortality rate under COVID-19 in other countries. I'm not quite sure what the statistics look like for Pakistan, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're similar. But I do think that unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that women are more protected in some sense. I think we see this in part because men just tend to be outside a lot more. A lot of the initial infections were also being passed around with some religious congregations. And that's, of course, again, the men who are interacting and then interacting with each other more. And then also, men tend to have more underlying health conditions because of a higher propensity to smoke or those sorts of things, more comorbid factors. But what's important, though, is I think, unfortunately, the healthcare point is also really important because even before the pandemic, there's these horrific stories you hear about women not being able to get to hospitals when they really need the help or their families not allowing operations and so on. And I think that, unfortunately, is only going to get worse. In particular, I have absolutely no statistics or data on this, but it's entirely possible as well that, women or maybe family members are less likely to get their women to be tested, even if they're not feeling well, because constrained resources, you have to pick and choose who goes to the hospital and who goes to a doctor. And so I think it's important to not just think automatically that because we see higher rates of infection among men, potentially in South Asian countries, that means that women somehow are, better off in the healthcare sense. But not to end on that pessimistic note, I'll try to say something positive in terms of the takeaways that you were mentioning. I think what Dr. Nida and Dr. Hadia said, both are points that I would have thought of as well. I think it's great that we're having this conversation, at least. Thank you for moderating this, and thank you to LUMS and everybody who's watching. And other than also washing hands, I think personally, I also love that there will hopefully be less, not everybody's going to want to shake hands and hug all the time, which I don't think is the worst social outcome in the long term. Just random people hugging. Don't look at me like that. Thanks.
Okay, Angbeen, any takeaways, any good things for now?
Well, I think everything's really been said. I agree about the environment. It's amazing. And I think for those of us who are lucky enough to not be worrying about, the food on the table, it's forced us to slow down enough to actually start to appreciate the smaller things that we really took for granted before this. So, things that we would rush through to actually get to work, it have now become the things that we do most of the day. And that's a good thing. I think it's in this world, it's a really capitalist world. It's a good thing to slow down and look at things around you.
Okay, I can't let you guys off the hook. We still have a minute or two. So here's my last question, and here's my indulgence. I'll start with Dr. Nida. Anything new or different that you've done in the last 8-10 weeks that you otherwise wouldn't do? Not work-wise, self-enrichment wise. Anything different that you've done that you were like, I'm so happy this lockdown happened and this?
No, I mean, there's a lot that has changed about the way that I live that I feel very lucky that I have been able to benefit from this in some way personally. And for me, just not rushing around like crazy, not feeling compelled to go out, visit people, go to shops, see sari cheez, and just not having that noise has really helped kind of still my mind and just focus on myself, my relationships, my health. So I think I'm very lucky that I've been able to do that. And dusri cheez, though, I think a lot of people are doing is I'm cooking. And I never cooked like this before. Like, I'm actually enjoying cooking. I'm never ordering food from outside. LUMS ki canteen mein, I've never, it's already, we joke about the food there, the wonderful people who are working there, and the food is excellent. But now I'm just cooking everything at home. And so that's a really nice thing. So I have benefited from that.
Excellent. Dr. Hadia, anything different or new?
Well, I hadn't made lasagna in the longest time, and I finally had the time to make it. But I take Angbeen's point in this to heart. We're very lucky. We're one of the privileged few who don't have to worry about keep getting food on our table. We live, a lot of us live in very safe communities, and that's just allowed us the time to slow down and do things which you wouldn't normally do. And I feel really privileged in that. And my heart goes out to everyone who's at this point struggling because of this pandemic.
Everyone's invited to Dr. Hadia's place for iftar today. Lasagna is on the menu. Dr. Rabia, anything new?
I mean, all the points made about sort of us being privileged enough to be in this position where we can have this conversation, but because we do need to wrap up, I think the one thing, I've been trying a few different things too, but I think the most different thing or interesting thing that I've been up to the last few weeks is learning how to play an instrument. I've been learning how to play the harmonium and learning some Eastern classical music and how to sort of sing Eastern classical. So I'm not sure how that's going to end, but it's definitely something that I've not had the time and the patience to indulge in before.
Okay, good choice. Food of soul, food for soul. Angbeen, anything new?
Not really. I mean, I've been spending time with my children and not rushing them all the time, which I think is probably a new thing. I'm not rushing them from point A to point B all day, it's a good thing. It's been good for us. Yeah.
Go easy on kids. Just a good idea. Go easy on kids. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Nida, Dr. Rabia, Dr. Hadia, Angbeen. Thank you so much for your time and for your ideas, for your knowledge. और जो हमारे साथी देख रहे हैं, please stay safe, please stay indoors, please wash your hands and look after yourself and your loved ones. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you and